Early on in my time in Noosa, we asked the wider community to send in questions that they'd like to ask God if they could. This question really struck a chord with me. My 54-year-old husband is dying of cancer. Why? The full question read, my husband has been struck down by terminal melanoma cancer. It's in his bones and organs. We found out about 4 months ago. He had no idea, no symptoms. He's now done chemo and radio and only has weeks to live as the chemo didn't work. He's just turned 54. Why? Of course, you can feel the pain and the anguish in that question. It just seems to make no sense. Why do bad things happen to good people? There are a couple of other questions along the same lines. Why do little children get sicknesses that are fatal? Why is there motor neurone disease? Why do babies and children have to suffer abuse? Live long enough in this world and you will have such questions. For some, this is the issue that leads them to conclude there is no God. Because surely an all-powerful God could end all the suffering, and an all-loving God would end all the suffering. So people conclude that because suffering exists, an all-powerful, all-loving God doesn't. But I want to say up front this morning that I don't have all the answers. And of course, there is some overlap with what we looked at last week. Why doesn't a good God stop a bad virus? I urge you to go back and look at that video if you can, if you missed it. But for a moment, I actually want to put the Christian response to one side. And I want to ask, how would some of the other major religions of the world answer this question? And I'm grateful to the Reverend Dr. John Dixon for the use of some of his material here. If you were a Hindu or a Buddhist, how would you answer that lady whose husband was dying? Or what about if you were of the Muslim faith, or even an atheist? How would you go about answering that lady's question? So let's have a first look at Hinduism, the Hinduism response. In Hinduism, it's the oldest of the world's religions. All the events in your life are a result of the way that you've lived in the past, or indeed in a past life. Karma is the universal balancing principle. Their text puts it this way: as a man acts, so he behaves, so does he become. Whatever deeds he does on earth, their rewards he reaps. So a Hindu family has just lost a child. In that moment, they are reaping karma for their deeds in this life or a previous life. A businessman sees a beggar by the side of the road, and he knows that what he's seeing there is divinely sanctioned balancing mechanism. Suffering is simply yet profoundly the balancing out of your deeds. So the answer to Our Lady who's losing her 50-year-old husband, it's the exact opposite to that line in The Sound of Music. Remember, somewhere in my youth or childhood I must have done something good. No, this is the opposite. Somewhere in my youth or childhood or past life, I must have done something bad. What goes around comes around. What about Buddhism? Perhaps more than in any other religion, Buddhism is in fact a response to suffering. So a prince who was over a region near the present-day borders of Nepal and India around 500 BC, lived in luxury, had a palace for every season of the year, had people to serve him, dancing girls, all the food that he wanted. He led a very sheltered life and he didn't know what went on outside the palace. One day as a young man, he ventured outside and he was shocked by what he saw outside the city walls. He saw sickness and the elderly and the frail and even a corpse. He was so shocked that he left his young wife and newborn child and embarked on a search for answers. For 7 years he deprived himself of all worldly luxuries, and yet he still did not understand the origin of pain. He sat under a tree and determined not to get up from meditating until he understood pain and suffering. Eventually, he had his enlightenment. All suffering, he saw, is the result of the attachments that you have to things of this world: clothes, food, relationships. All suffering is the result of those attachments. So the pain a child feels at the loss of his father is not caused by the event itself, but it's caused by the child's attachment to the Father. A beggar's suffering is caused by his attachment to the desire for a better life. If a child can detach from the Father, or a beggar can detach from the desire for a better life, suffering evaporates. It becomes an illusion. Now the logic is impeccable. But is it possible to live this way? Can a boy faced with a sudden loss of his dad suddenly let go of the desire to be with his dad? Can a beggar just suddenly lose the desire for a better life? So the Buddhist's answer to Our Lady's question about the pain of losing her 54-year-old husband to cancer is simply, well, stop desiring your husband and you'll suffer no more. What about the response of Islam? Islam offers a very different response. In Islam, all events of the universe are determined by an explicit decree of Allah. When a plane falls from the sky or a child has cancer, it is the hand of God. The reason is unknowable and unaskable. In Islam, you find solace as you submit to Allah. In fact, the very word Islam translates as submission to the will of God. Do not ask, don't dare to question, just submit. So the answer to Our Lady who's losing her 54-year-old husband is simply, don't ask, just submit. This is Allah's will. Resign yourself to it. Well, what about atheism? For the atheist, suffering is just the random intersection of time and space. Professor Richard Dawkins is one of the world's most famous present-day atheists, and he puts it this way. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So the question why is overruled, and there's no one to ask the question to anyway. Pain and suffering are evidence, so they say, of God's non-existence. Except there is one problem with the atheist's claim about the two premises that an all-powerful God could stop human suffering and an all-loving God would. Here's the problem, and even atheist philosophers acknowledge that a loving God may have good reasons for suffering to continue for a time. A wise, loving, purposeful God may use suffering to a greater end. So you can't use this argument to prove categorically that there is no God. So the answer to Our Lady's question as far as the atheists are concerned is, well, it's all just meaningless. There's no rhyme, there's no reason. It's blind, pitiless existence. Atheism offers nothing. So these are the alternatives. Are you reaping what you deserve? Karma. Is suffering born of desire and the way to escape suffering is to let go of your desire? Is it everything just a decree from God to which you must submit? Or are we really staring into the abyss where there is no God and everything is utterly meaningless? Let's ask the question then, where does a Christian response begin? And it begins with an invitation to ask. The Bible is full of people asking these sorts of questions. In fact, you heard it in that first reading from Psalm 73, where the author is riling out to God, how come the wicked get it so good and I've been faithful all my life and I'm suffering? So we read from Psalm 73, they have no struggles, their bodies are healthy and strong. He whinges about the wicked. Or what about Psalm 22, I beg your pardon. My God, why have you forsaken me? Or Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Or Psalm 74, why have you rejected us forever, O God? Or the prophet Habakkuk, How long, O Lord, will I call for help, but you do not listen? So the firm witness of the Bible, in fact, the encouragement of the Bible, is to cry out to God, to complain, to question, to rile. My 54-year-old husband is dying of cancer. Why, God? Why are you allowing this to happen? Why me? Why now? Cry out. In Islam, that is blasphemy. In Christianity, it's invited. Second, the Christian response continues with an understanding that God has suffered too. That's a huge claim, isn't it? But if Jesus is God turned up on earth, then we know that he has suffered too. He wept with the family of his friend Lazarus, who had died. He wept because of the people of the city of Jerusalem who did not believe. In his arrest and trial, he was beaten and mocked and flogged. And when he had faced the cruelest execution known to man, he took the words of Psalm 22 on his heart and cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" One of the earliest letters preserved for us from the first century says that we have someone in Jesus who is able to sympathize with us in every way. God has known firsthand human sorrow and sadness and loss and death. And then the Bible presents us with an understanding that God is with us in our suffering. In Psalm 23, the Lord's my shepherd, we read, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Or Psalm 16, "Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken." Or the early church leader Paul in another letter preserved for us. In fact, we read it in our second reading. "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles." So the God who welcomes our questions, the God who himself has known suffering, this is the same God who promises to be alongside us in our troubles, as close to us as our right hand, to comfort us and strengthen us. And finally, the Christian response begins with an understanding that this world is not all that it once was and not all that it will one day be. This is what we explored last week, that this world is a sad, twisted distortion of what it once was. And we saw that the Bible makes it clear that it's not what it will be in the future, that Jesus in his death and resurrection has won victory over death and evil, and that one day all sickness and all suffering will be gone and everything will be perfect once more. God has acted to end all the suffering, even though we wrestle still with the impact of it right here and now. But let's finish by returning to our question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why? Let me say what I can't tell you and what I can. I can't tell you why a particular sadness has come into your life at a particular time, nor can I tell you why it has happened to you and not to somebody else. But I can tell you this, that unlike the Hindu faith, it's not karma. It's not because you've deserved this, because of something you've done in your past or in a previous life. And I can tell you that unlike Buddhism, no one is asking you to cast off your attachment to your husband or to your pain-free life or whatever so that you'll feel better. And that unlike Islam, no one is telling you simply to submit and never to ask the question. And I can tell you that unlike atheism, it's not just a random act of meaninglessness in a pitiless existence. Out of all the worldviews, the Christian one, while it may not have all the answers, is the one that makes best sense to me. It meets you where you are because it welcomes your questions and your complaints. It invites you to ask, to rail against God, to tell him exactly how you feel. And we're reminded that God has suffered too. He's known it, he's felt it, he's wept, he's been indignant, he's been humiliated, He's known great physical and emotional pain. And he promises to be right with us in our suffering, as a refuge, and alongside us in the valley, as close as our right hand, with us to comfort us. And the Christian response reminds us that the world is not all that it once was, and not all that it will one day be, and all that is evil and utterly painful in this world has been defeated by Jesus' death and resurrection, and one day will be completely gone when we welcome the new creation. That's what I know. That's what I can tell you. And I hope that you'll reach out to God in your pain and find him very real and wonderfully comforting. Amen.